During the round 1 of playoffs, Fnatic drafted Kingdom Rogue in all 3 games, which led to a really clean trio. I wanted to go over all 3 drafts and try to analyze and explain how that happened. So starting with game 1, Rogue starts off by first picking Senna, which is really good. Senna is really flexible, she fits in pretty much every team comp. She can work in dive comps, she can work in control comps, poke comps. She's really good. And she also has really a solid laning phase, so it's a really good first pick. Going over the bans, Ezreal is fine, Shen is a good ban, GP is also a good ban. Shen is usually a good ban just because he's a safe blind pick, so it's not really necessary, but it's not bad. And then on Fnatic side they ban Caitlyn, and then Aphelios to target Ansama's champion pool, and then Orianna. Orianna, it's obviously a hit at Larson. I'm not sure it's necessary, but since she's also a blind pick on mid, since Fnatic has a last pick, they might want to hit that so they can be more flexible in their draft. First pick Sun is really good. The Azir, then Ashe coming from Fnatic is also really solid. She has a good laning phase. She can be paired with pretty much anything, and she fits out almost every team composition. The Lucian coming afterwards is not super common, but is also pretty good. Lucian can be flexed mid and top. Personally, I believe him is really good at mid because he doesn't really have a lot of losing matchups, and he kind of scales well as a mid laner. If you pick him top, you're losing a lot of champions that sometimes are really important, like tanks or GP, stuff like that. But in the mid, he kind of does the same thing, and he enables AP junglers to come in, so I think he's really good. Rogue answers with Azir. Personally, I think Azir Sen is a really strong combination. As I said before, Sen is really good at controlling areas and avoiding people to come in because of her W and because of the way her E works. She's also really good at poking, so she goes really well with Azir. And then Rogue drafts Renekton, and personally I'm not a super big fan of this pick for 2 reasons. The first reason is that you have Senna Azir, so these 2 champions have a theme right now, and it's to control an area. But you're picking a champion that wants to go into the enemy team, so you're basically making it so the Azir pick and the Renekton don't really work together, which is really weird, especially when you pick them around the same area. There's an argument that Renekton is extremely safe in this situation, and I agree. You banned GP and you banned Shen, which are really good counter picks or blind picks against Renekton. Not blind picks, counter picks. They have really good laning phase and they outscale him. So there's an argument for Renekton. I personally don't like it. I think if it were to come into the draft, it should be later, especially because the enemy team composition still can flex Lucian top, which is a really good Renekton counter. And then Fnatic answers with Evelynn, and now the reason Evelynn can come in so early is because Fnatic they know that bot lane is going to be stable because they have Ashe against Senna, and there's not a support that can flip the matchup super hard, especially because they have last picks, so they can always hide support until last. And then they also have Lucian, which can be flexed both top and mid. So they're likely gonna have a really good laning phase with priority. So Evelynn has two stable laning phases to play with, and they have last picks, so they're very likely getting also a stable laning phase top. Rogue decides to ban Ornn, which is good because he counters Renekton in the sense that he can survive laning phase, and then there's even solo kill potential. And then they ban Camille, and now the Camille ban, I think it's really weird. Usually if you're Rogue in this situation, I think you want the enemy to pick Camille. You want to use the Renekton as a bully lane so that Evelynn has less space. So if Fnatic were to pick Camille either here or either here or as last pick, it would be really good for Rogue because they get a lane that Evelynn can't really reliably farm around. So suddenly top side is a lot weaker. But they end up banning her, which is it's a bit weird in my opinion. Doesn't make a lot of sense. And then Fnatic goes for the Tahm ban. Personally, I think this is awful. Doesn't really make a lot of sense. I know that you have Evelynn, so you have a way to assassinate someone, and Tahm can kind of prevent that, but I'm not a big fan. Then the Lily ban I think is completely fine. Rogue ends up Actually, Fnatic goes for the trash pick, which is a really safe support. They want a safe counter pick for top. Personally, I think there's better options in this scenario, like you could go for Morgana or Lux. Personally, I think Lux is really good. She's really strong, and she does really well against what Rogue's composition wants to do because of all the shields and all the CC and stuff like that. So personally, I think Lux would be better here, but they end up going for a trash, which is still my bad, which is still completely fine. Rogue ends up answering with Nautilus. It's a bit of a just a neutral pick. You don't really scale, you don't really bully lane, but he has Engage, which can cut off Lucian, Ashe, and Evelynn. So it's not terrible. It's definitely, it's alright. I think there's better picks in this situation, but Nautilus is definitely not terrible. And then they end up going for the Sejuani, which this one is the one that I thought was really weird, because you're against Evelynn and Sejuani is really bad against Evelynn. She gets outpaced in the jungle. She doesn't have enough pressure early on to make stuff happen against Evelynn, who is a champion that usually you want to pressure. So something like an Olaf would be really good here, because you get to pressure. You don't really have weak lanes right now. You have a stable bot lane, you have a stable mid lane, and you likely have a stable top lane because it's Renekton. It's really hard for him to get pushed in unless he gets hard countered. So an Olaf would work really well here because then he can just invade Evelynn and try to mess her up. But Sejuani just plays into what Fnatic wants, so I think it's really bad by Rogue. And then Fnatic answers with Urgot, and I think Urgot is really good. He has an okay laning phase. It's a bit shaky, I think, levels 3 to 5 maybe. Level 6 it might get worse, but then he gets around level 9 and it becomes really solid. He's also really good against what Rogue is showing up, because he's really good against Nautilus, he's really good against Sejuani, he's really good against Renekton after laning phase, because those champions want to dive in and he can delete one of them with his ultimate and then fear the others. He can disrupt them when they're trying to dive in, and it does a lot of damage too. So Urgot is really solid in this situation. So this is game 1. Fnatic hard won this draft. It's not really that hard to see. Evelynn has a really easy time just farming. Fnatic outscales because of the Urgot and the Lucian. Then Evelynn is just gonna kill everyone in the enemy team. So there's not much Rogue can do. Going over game 2 now, Rogue starts by banning Ezreal, Akarim, and Evelynn. If they feel like they don't have an answer to Evelynn, I think it's a fine ban. And Akarim, I'm not really sure why he's getting banned. I know he was really popular in the SK versus Schalke series, but he's not that good, and there's ways to handle him, and especially when you're on red side and there's a lot of other picks. So I guess it's not a terrible ban, but I don't think it's necessary. And Fnatic ends up banning Caitlyn, Aphelios, and Orianna. Orianna again targeting Larson, and Aphelios to target Hansam, and then Caitlyn just because the champion is really strong right now. Rogue starts by first picking GP. I think first pick GP is really solid. He doesn't have a lot of bad lanes, and he wins against pretty much everything. Some losing lanes is stuff like Quinn and Set, but Set got nerfed really hard, so it doesn't work super well as a top laner anymore. And Quinn is not super popular, and she doesn't fit in every comp, so it's pretty solid first pick. He also has some other lanes that it's kind of more even, like a Kali, but again doesn't fit every comp, so completely fine. Fnatic answers with Sun at Thresh, which is really strong and stable lane, so pretty alright. Personally, I would have liked Sun Lucian to come out. Even if you're giving your hand a little bit early, I think it's completely fine, because there's not a lot of answers to Lucian, and it's technically a flex top that can counter GP. So Lucian here would be really good in my opinion. But they end up going for the Thresh, which is fine. It's not super good, but it's completely okay. Rogue answers with Kalista and Blitzcrank, and I don't really like this. Kalista can kind of synergize with GP in a way when he ults, and it becomes really hard to run away from the Kalista. But I don't think, generally, you're taking away a lot of flexibility from your own team, because you're forced to go in by picking Kalista. or well, you're not forced always to go in, but you're much more likely, and that's generally the theme that she enjoys. So I don't really like the Kalista pick here. Maybe on some it feels like it doesn't really have a champion pool to fall back on. I'm not totally sure. Maybe it just feels that Kalista is comfortable, but I don't really like the Kalista here. And then the Blitz is alright. There's not a lot of information on the enemy team, but it's generally a good pick, especially when your team composition isn't super well suited to handle the enemy, because he can create leads on his own and create openings for team fights, stuff like that. So Blitzcrank is fine, in my opinion. And then Ornn gets picked into GP, and this is completely fine. When you see the Kalista, you know that it's very likely that Rogue is forced to come into you, and Ornn is really good at answering that, and he has an okay lane against GP. If he goes Spellbook, you can even kill him at level 6, depending on how the matchup goes. He suffers a little bit early game, but that's normal. And then he has a safe lane. Then Fnatic ends up banning Trundle, which I don't really agree with. Not really sure why it's necessary. You don't have anyone that suffers a lot from Trundle. Maybe you could argue that Ornn suffers a lot from Trundle, and I guess if you put that into perspective, they don't have a lot of damage because they have Kalista. So if the Trundle comes in, suddenly the Ornn becomes a lot less of an issue. So maybe it's actually, I hadn't thought about that before, so maybe it's actually reasonable. I'm not totally sure. With that in mind, I don't think it's actually an awful ban. And then Rogue goes for Kha'Zix and Lee Sin. Now the Kha'Zix ban, I think it's really weird, because if Selfmade were to play a farming jungler, it would. I mean, he showed Evelyn in the last series. She got banned. There's Karthus. There's other picks. There's Lilia that I don't think it was banned yet. Yeah, because Fnatic bans it afterwards. So I'm not really sure on the Kha'Zix ban. I personally don't really like it. I'd have liked to see the Lucian ban because he came in last series and he has good lanes into the GP, and the Ornn is technically still a flex mid. So I'd have liked to see Lucian and maybe even Karthus or some other jungler. But they end up going for the Kha'Zix and the Lee Sin, and I don't really like either of these bans. And then the Lilius from Fnatic I think is perfectly fine. Fnatic ends up locking in Lucian on R4, which is really good in my opinion. He technically is a flex, he can go mid, and he has a lot of safe matchups and even good ones. It also makes it so playing Zoe is a lot harder, because he has really good matchup into her. So Lucian is really good in my opinion. And then Rogue ends up going for the Set and the Azir. The Azir in this situation, I kind of like it. I think it's good, but when you consider the comp that Rogue has in this instance, I don't really like it anymore. I think if Rogue goes Kindred or Graves, mostly Kindred, I think Kindred is really good in this scenario. They go Kindred here, and then they can go Azir and oh, what am I writing? Yeah, they go Kindred. I don't know how to type for Kindred. I'm not okay. They go Kindred here, and then they go Azir, and I think it's really good. It's kind of weird for the Kalista because she needs to play. She can't really go in the same way that she usually does, but it's a much better line for Rogue to play their draft than going Set and trying to brute force their way into a Ornn, Senna, Lucian, and there's still last pick that can come in. You could argue that instead of Karthus, maybe Gragas comes in if it's Kindred, but I think it's still a much better spot. Even if it's a losing spot, I still think it's a much better spot than playing this matchup Set versus Karthus in this scenario. And then, of course, the Set ends up coming in instead of the Kindred, which I don't really like. The Azir doesn't really sit well with the entire comp either, so they end up going for the Karthus on Fnatic's side, which is really good. They have stable lanes. Top suffers a little bit, but bot and mid is really stable, and then top becomes more stable later on. So Karthus has a really easy time farming up because it's really hard to punish him. This ends up making it so Fnatic is not only they have lanes that are really stable. They outscale bot lane with Senna. They don't really outscale top, but it's kind of even. and mid it's they get slightly outscaled, but because of the nature of the rogue's composition, Lucian is completely fine with that. And then they massively outscale in the jungle, which is really good for Fnatic. So they end up winning this draft by a mile. They basically start the game, and if they don't lose in 15-20 minutes, it's really hard to lose. Even if they lose like a couple team fights, it's really hard to lose in my opinion. So this draft is really good by Fnatic. Going into game 3 now, Rogue decided to go blue side once again, and I'm personally not a big fan of blue side in this patch. I don't think there's a lot of super strong first picks, maybe outside of Caitlyn. Even Caitlyn, I think she has a lot of answers, but she's really strong in pretty much all stages of the game because of the way her laning phase goes. So outside of Caitlyn, which was a really easy ban, I don't think there's anyone that's strong enough to justify going blue side. The other thing that I don't really like, or that makes me prefer red side, is that it's a lot easier to answer the enemy team composition on red side, because you get to see the first pick, and if it's not a super broken champion, then you can answer with something that's really stable. Like in this case, Senna is really good, Nautilus is alright, and then you also get the last pick, which is really important because you get to save one pick, and it just enables a lot of stuff. Like you can play. It's a lot easier to play farming junglers like Evelynn and Karthus. It's a lot easier to pick Kassadin. It's a lot easier to play a weird top laner like Zillion top or something. So I think red side has a lot more flexibility, and it's a lot easier to answer the enemy or the blue side picks. So going over the actual draft, Rogue starts by banning Shen. I think Shen is fine. He's a really good blind pick, and he does well in pretty much every matchup right now. He's also good against Renekton, who's really popular because of how strong he is early. They end up banning Trash, which I don't really agree, but it's a ban targeted at Hylissang, so it makes a bit of sense because he's not known for his champion pool. And then they ban Lucian, which I think it's completely fine, especially after how the last 2 games went. Fnatic not really changing their bans. They go for the Caitlyn, they go for the Aphelios, and they go for the Yuumi. And I think there's some arguments to have about the Yuumi. Maybe they saw that Rogue didn't ban the Ezreal, so they're like, maybe Rogue will pick Ezreal because we want Senna, so let's ban Yuumi. And if that's their thought process, then I think it's completely fine. Rogue ends up first picking GP. Once again, I think it's the same thing in game 2. I think it's completely fine. Doesn't really have a lot of bad matchups, and is a really solid pick. And then Fnatic goes and picks Senna Nautilus, which I don't really like the Nautilus this early. I think there's better options, but Hylissang doesn't have a super big champion pool and is probably really comfortable on it, so it's completely fine. Rogue answers with Ezreal, which I think is really good, and Azir. And I'd say that Rogue is actually winning in this spot because they have a lot of long range, they have a lot of scaling, they have okay laning phases so far. Even if you don't know the mid laner, Azir doesn't really have super terrible laning phases, and GP is the same. He has a lot of good laning phases, very few bad ones. So it's very likely that all 3 lanes are going to be good for Rogue. So this is looking really good. And then Fnatic comes in with Kog'Maw, and Kog'Maw is really good in this spot. He's really good against Azir because he outranges him. He's really good against Ezreal because of the same reasons. He pretty much outranges everyone, which is really good. And then he kind of suffers against GP because of the way GP's ult works. He has trouble running away from it. But outside of that, he's in a really good spot. Bard ends up being banned, and then it gets answered by Ornn and Cho'Gath. Ornn probably to prevent a good lane in the top, and Cho'Gath likely for the same reasons. Not really sure about the Bard ban. I think it's okay because GP Bard can threaten Senna and Kog'Maw really hard, so it's not really a bad ban in my opinion. And then Leona ban comes in. Not really sure. I don't think it's necessary. There's probably other supports, but at the same time, Fnatic is in a situation where if they don't get engaged on, it's really easy to just keep their range. Or well, it's not super easy because GP is a thing, but they get to keep their range, and it's really annoying to chase into them when there's Senna, when there's Nautilus, and when there's Kog'Maw. So I think the Leona ban is not terrible. It could be argued for that there's better bans, but I don't think it's bad. And then Sion comes in from Fnatic. Sion has kind of a tough laning phase against GP early on, but he ends up coming in after the first recall usually. He starts clearing the wave really fast, and he can kind of just trade CS with GP. He can also threaten GP in some scenarios, so it's not really a super bad laning matchup. And then Rogue answers with Set and Braum, and I don't really like Set in this spot. It's pretty much the same reasons as game 2. You're playing against, you have Sion, where you can ult into the backline, but it's not super easy to do so, and you're playing against champions that outrange you really hard. So what I would like to see here in this scenario, I would like to see Gragas, I would like to see Kindred, I would like to see Graves. Like Graves in this spot is really good because you go lethality and then you just threaten the Senna and you threaten the Kog'Maw just by clicking R, and then you have really safe laning jungle matchup. So I think Graves, Gragas are all really good champions in this situation, but they end up going for Set. I think even Olaf could be picked in this situation. It makes it harder to pick farming junglers, but they end up going for the Set, which is not really, I don't really like it. And then they follow with Braum. I was trying to think about what champions could be better than Braum in this situation, but I couldn't really think of many. Lulu doesn't like. Lulu is really good with Ezreal and Azir, but she doesn't really like Kog'Maw. She doesn't like Evelynn. She doesn't like Senna. Not even Sion. So same. Maybe Karma could be really good in this situation. You get the speed forward. You get the shields. I think Karma would be really solid. But yeah, Braum is definitely not terrible, especially because the champion pool, the support pool got hit so much. Braum is definitely okay, and then Fnatic ends up going for Evelynn. And at first when I saw this pick, I thought it was really bad because you have the Kog'Maw pick, which is already AP, and you generally don't want more AP in your comp because it benefits a lot from not having to build White Staff super early. But I think it's actually completely fine. For two reasons. So the first one is that Evelynn is actually, she doesn't care about building White Staff second. Most champions do, but Evelynn actually doesn't care that much. She doesn't really need a utility from Zhonya's. She doesn't generally need Banshees. So White Staff I think is completely fine second if you really need to. The other thing is that Evelynn actually one-shots champions even through one item, one MR item, as long as she's farmed. And there's not a lot of MR items that these champions can buy. So like Azir, he gets Banshees. It's not super good. Banshees still gets one-shotted. The shield isn't even that effective against Evelynn because she's gonna smite him and then doubly one-shot him. So that's bad. Ezreal gets X Drinker and Death Dance. So Death Dance he still gets one-shot. And X Drinker, the shield doesn't really work against Evelynn because it comes in after the ult is already in lethal, so she procs the crit. So Ezreal is not in a super good position when it comes to building MR either. And then GP can maybe get X Drinker, he can maybe get Death Dance, but it's still the same as Ezreal is really threatened by by Evelynn. So I think Evelynn is actually completely fine in this situation. Even if it seems a bit weird. And then Kog'Maw doesn't super care if the enemies have MR because he just wants to threaten, and if they build MR then they're really susceptible to Senna, so yeah, I think this comp from Fnatic is really balanced. They pretty much hit everything, they hit the nail on the head on everything, and I think this was probably the closest draft in this series, because even though the draft favors Fnatic, I'd say Rogue still has a really good chance of winning this game. They can try to snowball off top, they can try to snowball off mid. If they get ahead early, they can kind of stick to their lead, contrary to game 1 and 2, where even if they get ahead, it's really hard to maintain the lead because the enemy champions are just so much better. So yeah, I think Rogue probably had their best shot in this game, but they end up not being able to execute, and they end up going 3-0. So yeah, that's everything. Thank you for watching.